So hi everybody, welcome to my channel. In my last video we discussed crochet hooks and things to look for when you're crafting. Now we're going to switch to my area of expertise, and again we're going to be doing both crocheting as well as knitting. If you're not interested in knitting, you can skip this video because this is solely for us knitters. And you might, if you're new to crafting, you might be, well, what the heck's the difference between knitting and crocheting? And I'll get into that in a minute. But we all know someone in our family, whether it be a grandmother, a great-grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, a brother, a sister, mom, or somebody, you have probably seen these used at some point in your life. I have very fond memories. These are my grandmother's knitting needles. These are what they call a straight line knitting needle. And what that means is when your yarn is on it, you can only go back and forth. That's all you can do. You can do back and forth. You cannot knit in the round, and we'll get into that in a minute. But these are very much loved. They were my grandmother. I do not use these needles at all. They're very heavy when you get projects that are long. These things can get really, really, really heavy, but they do work. I could still knit a project with these. These are a 9mm or a size 13 knitting needle. Now, just like crochet hooks, knitting needles go by the millimeter, but they go by numbers versus letters. Crochet hooks are slightly different. They'll go from millimeters, same as knitting needles, but they go by letter versus a number. So, if you're new to knitting, welcome. Pardon me, I'm going to drop those off. Hopefully you are crafting your projects and you're finishing up your projects for the holiday. I know right now I am in a race to finish a sweater that I am knitting for a Christmas gift. I have the final sleeve to do and then some embellishment, and I'm hoping to finish this. So you might be wondering what this type of a needle that has these little points, and I laugh. These are actually what they call needle tip protectors. I call them little nipples because when they're just standing, they look like little nipples. But their proper term is they're needle point protectors. So this is considered a circular needle, and if you look closely at this, I'm going to try to get some of that out. You can see that I am knitting in a circle or knitting in the round. We'll get into what all of those terminology is at a later date. But my preference is working on circular needles. And there are benefits of circular needles. But before we get into circular needle sets and what you can do with it, let's talk, if you are a beginner knitter, what you want to look for in needles. One, I would suggest, if you're new to knitting, go out and get a bamboo set of clover needles. Now, you can get those usually at any of the big box stores. You can also get those at your local yarn shops, and you can get them on Amazon. And I am not sponsored by any of these companies. But bamboo needles are usually easier for a beginner to work with than a metal needle. And I will bring this in close so that you can see that, in fact, that is a metal needle. And we'll get into what my favorite brand of knitting needles are. I've been knitting for quite a while, and this is my third sweater that I'm working on. And I have other projects that I'm currently knitting. And we'll get into what needles work. Everybody is different with their needle preference. And there are a ton of knitting needles out there. And if you on YouTube do a Google search for knitting needle reviews, you'll be able to look at this. Now, if you're new to knitting and you're like, well, where do I go to get knitting needles? You can usually get them at the big box stores. I suggest not doing that. I don't suggest buying them on Amazon either. A lot of the companies, especially if you're buying a full set, and in a minute I'm going to show you a full set and a partial set and what that actually means. This happens to be a Shigu full set and is probably my favorite needle. These are Haya, and we'll get into costs and all of that in a minute. The reason I wouldn't go through Amazon is getting a lot of knockoffs right now, and if you want the real McCoy, your best option is to go to an actual store. And if you have a local yarn store, chances are they will carry all of the brands that are mentioned. They also, chances are, will allow you to visually not only see them, but if they're good yarn stores, they will allow you to hold them, get comfortable with them, and see what your preference is, because there are a lot of knitting needles out there, and they sell for a different price points. Every needle is different for the user, so no needle is the same. I mean, they'll be the same millimeters and stuff, but every crafter that knits differently. And we'll get into terminology. We're not going to do that on this video. That's going to be coming up. This is just let's get you started for my new channel in crafting next year. So why do I like circular needles? Well, circular needles give you a lot of options versus a straight line needle. And again, if you're wondering, this is a straight line needle. Now, all needles are sold in sets. Now, I'm going to take a step back. When I'm talking sets, I'm not necessarily talking this. Each needle comes with two, so there's a pair per set of needles. So per needle purchase, they come in twos, because you cannot knit with just one needle. You have to have a second needle to knit. Now, why is it better to get a set of needles versus just going out and buying, like, let's say you have a project and it tells you a US size 6 4mm needle, use that for the project. Well, in knitting, a lot of times, depending on what you're knitting, sometimes they can switch needles, especially if you're working on clothing. If you're working on sweaters, they may have you do the body in one. Oh, let me bring this up. They may have you do this entire body with one particular needle. It may say use a US size 6 or a 4mm, but then when you get to the fine details of the bottom, and I'll kind of bring, it's kind of hard to see this because this is a very dark blue, but when you do the embellishment on the bottom, or the ribbing is what it's called, you could switch down a needle size. So that means you have to have two sets of needles. You have to have a small one. Now, when you're working on sleeves, unfortunately, if you're working on the body of a sweater, you're using a very long cable. And if you're wondering what a cable looks like, this is what a circular cable is. And these come in different lengths. They come in 16, 24, 32, 36, 40, and if you're lucky, you can get also in a 50. But if you're knitting a sweater, let's say you're doing the body of the sweater with a 50-inch cord, when you get to the sleeves, there's no way on earth you can use something this big unless your arms are gigantic size. You need to go to a smaller cord so that you're not knitting big, you're knitting kind of small for the sleeves, and we'll get into that later. These red ones with the cord, these are what they call interchangeable cords, and what that basically means is I can take the tips off and I can switch them. Now, Chigoos, and I'm going to show you my full set, are my preferred needle. And this is what they call a Chigoo. A good set of circular knitting needles, especially if they're interchangeable, you're going to figure you're going to pay over $100 for them. Now, the Chigoo sets are closer to the $200 mark, especially if you get a full set. So I'm going to open my Chigoo full set, and I'm going to let you guys see what they are. And I think these are my size 7, which means I probably will need them shortly. But on one side of my interchangeable, and you might notice in my pack that a needle or 2 needles are missing. Well, currently I'm working on the sleeve, so this needle is currently sitting in this sweater sleeve. That's what I'm using. And this one is in another project. So, this particular set starts with a 2.75 millimeter or a US size 2 and goes through a US size 8. That's a small set. That's what they call a small set. And they have cords that are interchangeable for these needles. But if I flip this over, you're going to notice I have even more needles. And this goes through, it continues the size, but it goes from a size 9 all the way up to a US 15 or a 10 millimeter. That's what a 10 millimeter needle looks like. Now, these also come in length. They come in a 4-inch and a 5-inch. This happens to be the 5-inch. I'm a male, and I prefer the 5-inch. And the 5-inch is usually pretty good if you're working on a magnitude of projects. Now, you can do a sweater with a 5-inch needle. However, when you get to a smaller section, such as these, you may have to switch to a smaller cord, and these are a 4-inch. Meaning from the tip of here to where it screws into the cable, and I'll try to bring it in, so where it screws in, right where my finger is, that's 4 inches. And that matters a lot, especially if you're working in very, very small areas, or if you're doing socks. If you're doing socks and they're round, having a 4-inch versus a 5-inch, you'll notice a great difference. And this is my other set of needles, and this is my 4-inch. These are my Hiya needles. And Hiya are very good needles for a starter. They're a little bit less. They're about half the price of this, unless you buy both sets. Now, Hiyas don't come in full sets. They come in what they call half sets. So, you might be wondering, well, what the hell is a half set? Well, a half set starts at a US 9, and again, goes to, I believe, these are, oh, no, these are 15. So they go from a 9 to a 15. This is also a 5-inch set. This particular kit was about $88. Might have been a little bit less than that. You can also get the smaller set, which starts at a US 2 and goes to a US 7. US 8, I'm sorry, US 8. And you can do a lot of projects with that. But if you're like me and you do a lot of knitting and you want good options, then getting a full set of needles will actually save you money in the long run. They are an investment to get. And if you're new to knitting, I would not suggest running out and spending a whole lot of money on a needle set. I would start with a bamboo needle, work your way up, and then once you are comfortable with knitting, then I would splurge and I would get a full set of needles. Also, the biggest mistake that most knitters, and I'm guilty of this myself, is you will purchase the same needle over and over and over again. So it's always good when you go for your first needle to write down what the size of the needle is, what the brand is of the needle, so that you're not making the same purchase over and over again. Now, people do get into projects. I don't always just knit sweaters. I'm also have a blanket project that I'm in the middle of. I'm going to have another project that I'm going to be starting shortly after the holidays. Hopefully I'll be done with this by then. But I'll have multiple needles that'll be in different projects. And you just need to work through the projects to get your needles. Now, if you're like me and you have multiple projects going on, and you're like, oh dear, I have a size 8 in one project, a size 7 in another. I want to start a third project that's going to use a size 7. I don't have a 7. You can always run to the yarn shop or big box store and pick up a cheaper pair of needles. Now, you're going to have multiple sets, and that's okay. I have a ton of needles that are the same size, but knitting needles are a little bit different, where they don't come. If you watched my crochet video, they don't necessarily come with these. With usually, if the kit's expensive, like the Shigoo, you will get some stitch markers. You won't get scissors, and you usually won't get a tape measure. But what you will get is you'll get other things. Like, for example, you don't have to run out and get a... I'm going to kind of show you guys here in a minute what comes with a kit, so that you guys kind of know what a kit comes with. Most good kits will come with the cables. And for the Shigoo, they will tell you which tips you can use. Like, this is a 5-inch tip for the large size. So that automatically, I know, is from a US 9 through the 15. We'll use these cables. But it will also come with your smaller set needles. And this is the 5-inch, and it's got the small, and it tells you what size. This set came with a 14, a 22, and a 30. I happen to have a 50-inch cable right here. And these are what you stick in the holes to tighten your needles. And they're very nice. I have a 37-inch cable in it that's probably on a project. They come with stitch markers. They come with a ruler, and this is nice because if you are unsure, or if your needles don't tell you what size they are, you put them through here, and this will actually tell you what size needle you're working with. And then sometimes they'll come with the cute hard side, because this is kind of flimsy. It bends really easy and stuff, but it'll come with this, and this is also a stitch marker. And it gives you not only the millimeters of what size, but on this size, it tells you the US needle size. So this is a great thing to get. It also comes with cable holders. This actually, you screw these into the cables, and it prevents your yarn from sliding off while you change your needles. It comes with a grip pad, and it comes with connectors, and I'll show you these at some point. I'm not going to do it today, but these little tips down here, and I'll try to get in close. those actually, if you need to make a even longer cable and you don't have the size, you can hook up two cables and make it any size you want. So you could have an 80-inch size if you hook two 40 centimeter cables together. You'll have a really, really big one. So what are the benefits of circulars versus the straight line needles? Well, it gives you options to work in the round. So sweaters, if you're doing a raglan or a top-down sweater, you can do it in the round where you're just knitting and you don't have any purling necessarily to do as you're making it longer. You can also use circulars as a straight line needle. You don't have to do it in the round. You can go back and forth on a circular needle. Now it does take, I'll be honest, let me grab this sleeve. It does take practice for this, because on the cables, and I'm going to kind of pull this up, but I don't want to pull it all out because I have what they call, these are live stitches, meaning if something happens to these, all of my stitches could drop and I'd have to pick them up, and we'll get into that later. But the cables for knitting, I'll kind of move this back, so let me see if I can grab it. I don't want to pull too hard, but it's very flexible. So when you work on it, it does take practice knitting on a circular needle, because most people that start out are used to the straight line needles. These are more flexible, and I find actually these are easier to work with than the straight line, but the straight line needles are probably a must-have for a beginner, because you will find yourself not fighting with the needle like you will on a circular, especially if you've never knitted before. So if this is your first time and you're wanting to knit, go out and get a Clover size US size 8 needle. That's probably the calmest needle to have. 7s are also very common. So 7 and 8 are very common sizes to do projects. We'll do a couple of projects with those. If you start going down to the smaller needles, and this is a US 6, you're starting to get really, really small. So getting a bigger needle to start with probably would be more beneficial, but don't go too big. You don't want the tree trunk needles, because then you're going to not like what you're knitting. So start with a US size 7 or 8 Clover bamboo needle if you're new. If you're already an established knitter, and you will already have your preference of which needles to get. And in a later video, we'll definitely talk about knitting needles and their costs, because they can go from the cheapened, and these are not exactly cheap. These were pricey. These have benefits, and they also have drawbacks. The Hi-His are probably not my favorite needles. They're my favorite for some projects, and for other projects, they're not my favorite. But the Xiegu needles are my favorite, and I'll explain in a later video why I like that. They do make more expensive needles if your money is not an object. The Addi needles are probably the Cadillac of knitting needles. So go out, enjoy, go buy your first set of knitting needles. After the holidays, we're going to start crafting. I have found out on my channel, we have, I think, more crocheters. So our first project probably will be a crocheted project. And then as we advance, we'll get into knitting. And if you're a knitter and you're like going, I don't crochet, but I'll knit, start a project, and you can always knit while we're crocheting. So I bid you guys a good night. Keep tuning in, because I will give you more tips of what we're going to get into in January. And hopefully you all have your Ravelry accounts by then, because we're going to use the pattern on Ravelry to get started. So, I will see you on the next crafting video. Craft on, and may all of your projects come out great.